Hello and welcome. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of technical issues, but we're up and running right now. So thank you for joining us. We have an exciting webinar to discuss about building a cannabis company, and we have fantastic guests. We have Bryan Mosser from Carma Cannabis Insurance, Emily Wolfley from Greenleaf Business Solutions, Suehiko Ono from Cogent Law, and me myself, Jared Schwass, also from Cogent Law. I will first we'll do a little bit of introductions. I'll pass it around to Emily first to introduce yourself and your business.
Hi, everybody. Like Jared said, I'm Emily Wolfley. I work at Greenleaf Business Solutions. I myself work in a very consultative capacity with cannabis operators, owners, founders, where I'm able to take a deep dive into their business and not just the surface level, but what they're doing operationally day to day, see what's working, what's not, where there's gaps in their operating procedures. And a big part of what I focus on is helping them build out, obviously, their payroll, but everything between HR and their compliance infrastructure. So that's a little bit about what we do at Greenleaf. I'll pass it on to Bryan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jared. Yeah, it's good to be on the webinar again. So I think it's been a couple months since we did our last one. So I'm Bryan Mosser, Carma Insurance. So we specialize in cannabis insurance. I've been in the cannabis insurance industry since 2018. It's definitely evolved over the last couple of years. It's really started to Main Street and really pick up as it's become more normalized. And I think this panel is great because all three segments within legal, compliance, and insurance really do tie in well together, especially for a startup, a startup type business, and then also as a business starts to scale. These are all things that you need to keep in mind as well. So excited for the conversation today.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited as well. Suehiko, do you want to introduce yourself and give a little bit of your background?
Sure. My name is Suehiko Ono, and as Jared said, I'm a partner at Cogent Law. My focus is obviously cannabis. I have, I started my career way back when in as a tax attorney, but evolved over the time and spent a good amount of time as an operator in cannabis. Started a outdoor cultivation facility in Massachusetts, and then worked as a general manager for a vertically integrated operation in New York. Most recently have been operating as a fractional general counsel, so covering the full gamut of the things required for cannabis as we do.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and my name's Jared Schwass. I'm corporate and regulatory attorney with focus on cannabis law. I've been working with cannabis clients since 2017, starting with a small mom and pop and getting the licenses and working to sell them, and then transition into working with large national MSOs and consolidation and acquiring through the buy side. And then I also had a little stint also in the regulatory side where I worked as a county counsel for a local county up in Northern California to fix their cannabis program. And right now, I'm assisting businesses on similar to Suehiko as a fractional general counsel, assisting with corporate regulatory and general business needs. So great. That's us. That's the panelists. We and how we like to do our webinars is thank you. Is we like to just kind of have a fireside chat. I'll we have a couple of topics we want to talk about and a couple of questions within those, and we'll just pass it around and provide you guys with some good insights and some valuable information on building cannabis businesses and how to get a strong foundation for scale and growth to move forward and potential easy exit at the end of that. So we'll kind of start it off. We'll pass it off to Suehiko first. What's one thing founders consistently underestimate when building a cannabis business?
Yeah, well, I mean, from day one of the things that I have seen is corporate structuring and setting it up, right? So it's always very state specific. And what I mean is, I'm at a point where right now in New York where we're seeing some consolidation and transfer of licenses and transfer of entities, but there's great restrictions on that. And so the entity structuring from the beginning, I think could have helped ease this transition quite a bit. There's quite a few other things. Obviously, we'll talk about it in more detail, but setting up the financials, the chart of accounts, right, from a compliance and regulatory framework, knowing what is going on from a financial inventory management, ERP systems. I think a lot of people think, well, we'll just get going and then we'll come back and fix it when we need it. But that's when it's most difficult to restructure and revise systems.
Yeah, agree. And from a risk and insurance side, Brian, what do you kind of see as people underestimating?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we see with a new venture, or even some of the as companies start to expand, is they view insurance as just checking the box, and they treat it just like, well, we need to have it because the state says we need to have it, and they're not reading their policy. They don't understand some of the coverage gaps, some of the exclusions in their policy, because they're not understanding that true risk management part of the insurance aspect of it. And then getting over to compliance, same thing with understanding the hiring and firing, the employee handbook, and how that's so important to follow the SOPs of forming their entity and their business, and understand that their insurance premiums are directly affected by the story that they paint to the underwriters and to the carrier. And if they don't have those compliance things done, it just makes it more difficult for getting insurance, but then also having the right insurance to fit their need.
Speaking about the hiring and firing, I have a lot of issues popping up with that. Emily, can you kind of touch on what, at your experience have seen that people come in on the cannabis and what they're kind of underestimating with the HR side of it?
Yeah, definitely. So going off of kind of Brian just set me up for what I was going to say, but the people side of the business is truly the most important. I think that anybody that's been in any type of business, traditional or cannabis, know that the people are your most important asset. But if the infrastructure and the HR components aren't in place day one, then people can also become your biggest liability. And I see, and from my perspective of talking to owners, founders every single day, from startups to already established businesses, cannabis as a whole, I feel like focuses on compliance in terms of an operational level without truly understanding that as soon as their first W-2 employee is hired, like more than 120 regulatory bodies turn their microscopes directly on them. I like to call it alphabet soup, but I'm talking about the Department of Labor, the IRS, EEOC, all of these different regulatory bodies. As soon as that first employee is hired, directly focuses their attention on them. And that is what we want to try to avoid and not be so reactive, but really start out being proactive.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen that kind of the not understanding really what the world they're getting into when they start bringing employees, and then the backlash with that. So, yeah, it's a big. I can see that 100%. And so, Hiko, kind of go on your point about the structure, building the structure. At what point do you think a startup should bring in legal? And if they don't bring it in at that point, what kind of risk are they going to face in the future?
Sure. Yeah, well, obviously we're all a little bit biased on this panel here, but the sooner the better. I mean, even from the start, when we're talking about even at the beginning of structuring, corporate structuring and licensing application. And I'll give you a specific real world example to kind of make this concrete. But as I alluded to right now, in New York, we're seeing some consolidation and attempts at transfers of licensing. Now, as it stands in New York, the OCM is not allowing transfer of licensing, but what we see is what I've seen so far is a number of clients who have organized as, let's say, within a business corporation structure, which provides certain limitations, but not the least of which was they put all of their licenses into one entity. And so any of these businesses that want to transfer one of their licenses, they're at a position where they simply cannot and won't be able to for some time because they're all held by one entity. And so they can't, let's say, get into a transaction with a distribution license or with their processor license or with their cultivation license separately it's kind of come to this sort of all or none type of situation. And that's just one example. But, to your, succinctly answering your question, Jared, it's the earlier the better.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And and not only just the licensing, because that issue, you don't even know if you'll ever be able to resolve that issue, because yeah, at that point you're going to have to rely on the regulators allowing any sort of license transfer to get one of those license out of an entity, and it's not looking like it's going to happen anytime soon at all. And then
Right.
also, the cost it takes to, from a legal's perspective, the cost it takes to unwind a mistake is significantly, I want to say 10x, 20x the cost it is to prevent a mistake from happening. And that, that even starts at the founder investing schedules and setting up, if you're doing any sort of partnership with, someone that you just met, or even if it's a friend, once money starts hitting, things come out, you don't know the situation. It's really important to get the legal foundation squared, so everything's squared away at the beginning of it, because you do risk significant costs. That's one thing interesting with in corporate. I did litigation for a while, but in corporate, you sign these agreements, everything. It's all the honeymoon stages. Everything's happy, and then and then at the end of the day, when things kind of hit the fan and no one's happy, then you look at the agreements like, oh, I didn't mean that, and it's like, well, we're too late there. So. Bring it on. Bring a legal counsel on early as possible, in my opinion. And then from an insurance side, Brian, is there any advantage of of having legal representation early on, securing that insurance?
Absolutely. Anytime you can tie in the legal compliance from just building out their, what are their plans? And that's what we try to do when we talk with our brokers, and we're talking with a lot of new ventures that are just starting, is have they reached out to counsel? Have they reviewed their lease? Have they talked what is their plan? And that's what we try to understand, that way they have the right insurance as they scale and as they grow. Do they plan on adding a new location? Do they plan on adding new product? The THC drinks are starting to come into it. Just what is their, what's their plan for the next 18 months? That way everyone's on the same page. There's no surprises. And if we have that information up front, then we can help them scale. And they don't have those large premiums that come up by surprise because they didn't realize. And that's the one thing that a lot of insureds don't think about, is they just assume. And then we talked about on the last webinar, is they assume they have coverage. They assume that their landlord will allow this policy. So there's a lot of assumptions. So anytime you can talk with compliance, with legal, with insurance, and we're all rowing in the same direction, that's helpful for everyone.
And Emily, I don't know how much legal X aspect for the HR, but if you want to also talk about the HR systems that you would want a company should put in place before it hires its first 10 employees, kind of dive into the startup foundation of the HR in addition to the legal, the importance of that.
Yeah, well, in terms of legal, yes, I always like to ask whoever I'm talking with when the last time, because obviously we know how important handbooks are. It is the worst when I'm talking to somebody that's just starting out and they are like, what is a handbook? Because that really is what is going to protect you. So I always want to make sure when the last time their handbook was legally reviewed, because just because they put it together off of a platform or some already created handbook does not mean that when the time comes an employee gets upset, that there are definitely gaps in there for lawsuits. So I always want to make sure that their handbooks and their job descriptions are legally reviewed. So yes, it is definitely important, and there is a little bit of a legal aspect. But in terms of HR systems that I would want in place before a company even hires its first 10 employees, I'm from California originally, and I used to think that California was the most litigious state of all time. But then as I began working predominantly in the New York territory, I'm like, oh my goodness, from coast to coast, it is just ridiculous. And how does any single person or even a group of people, how are they able to keep up with the ever-changing laws and compliance and everything that each state, and in New York, it differs county to county as well. So how does anybody even keep up with all of that? So HR systems that I would want in place are obviously everything that we are talking about here. You need payroll and HR that is cannabis compliant, insurance, and lawyers. And while it might not be investing into revenue generating aspects, it will only save you money in the long run.
Yeah. That's one thing about, hiring service professionals. Sometimes people get a sticker shock at the beginning, but just wait till you got problems, then you'll get a real sticker shock.
Exactly.
And just kind of pass it around. Just trying to think of the differences between starting a traditional business and starting a cannabis businesses. What's the difference between them? And I'll jump on it. Like Suehiko, like you mentioned, the formation structuring is really important. You need to make sure that each license holding entity is isolated as much as possible. I would say even any sort of assets, whether it's property, equipment. I feel any other asset should be held outside of that, because to transfer the license, you have to sell the business, and so to be able to do that efficiently, if you have a license holding business as isolated as possible, that is the easiest transfer that you could have, rather than having it compiled with debt, with other assets, and so it's structuring and isolating, and also. I know that everyone loves LLCs. They're easy to form. Don't get me started on not having operating agreements with LLC. Always have an operating agreement with LLC, or else it's not valid. But anyway, so for cannabis companies, do not the license holding entities, I do not recommend LLCs because of the 280D AED inability to take traditional business deductions, because the IRS can come to the owner's personal can hold owners personally liable if there's improper deductions, which is it's elevated with the 280E and the inability to take those business deductions. And some people like to get creative, which there's a lot of creativity going out there right now. But just know, if you have an LLC and you have a CPA that's trying to get creative, or a lawyer or tax attorney that's trying to get creative, if you have an LLC, that can, if the IRS doesn't like that creativity and finds that it was an improper deduction, the IRS can come at you hold you personally liable for those improper deductions. So I always recommend corporations. And so yeah, that's kind of the major, especially for a startup, the difference for me in cannabis and traditional businesses. Traditional businesses, I don't think that really plays that big of effect. So yeah, what about Suehiko? You want to touch on that?
Sure. Yeah, I guess, I'll piggyback off what you're saying on the 280E. And, I think people underestimate, both in their modeling and the structuring, as you're saying, the importance of 280E. And let me also clarify, because I've heard various opinions on this. 280E is still very much in effect. Now, it is being litigated in tax court, New Mexico New Mexico Top Organics v. Commissioner, and they're challenging the basic claim that they're trying to state that 280E does not apply because of this imminent rescheduling. But on the face of 280E, it is very clear that it applies to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. So I think it makes the most sense to be careful and continue to operate as if. And one of the things I also advise, to your point, there's pros and cons, right? If you're assuming that this is going to be a profitable business, there can be arguments to be made to structure as an LLC and tax as a partnership, so you can make distributions without the double taxation. But the very real risk that Jared just stated is very important to be aware of. And so one of the things I advise is, if that is the case, that the entity is going to make distributions, that is very important to sort of self-insure, to essentially model and pay tax on perhaps the more aggressive reading of 280E, but then to make sure that you hold back in the event that the IRS does not agree with the characterizations. Now, with that said, to Jared's point, it still makes very much sense to separate out these entities, to separate the different functions, the equipment, IP, for all of these reasons, because there are ways to structure it so that the 280E burden is not as heavy. But again, this does take very, very careful structuring. And one that I think is I've seen overlooked many, many times, which then is all downstream into the financials, the chart of accounts, which has to do very much, the importance of financial reporting to the IRS, of course, but to stakeholders, shareholders, all of that. So cannot overstate the importance of what Jared's saying there.
You and Emily, how does HR play different roles between a traditional business and a cannabis business, if at all?
So I would say that oftentimes I hear that business owners are coming to me and they say, well, I don't know if we need HR, or I'm HR, and we just follow standard employment practices or standard operating procedures, in the traditional space, or I've started a business in the traditional space, so it should be very similar, and I think I can do it on my own. And what I always tell them, and what I'm sure all of us in this room know, is that cannabis, unfortunately, is just not the same. We are held to such higher, like everything, higher standards in everything. And so, again, you have very specific federal and state conflicts, banking limitations, state specific employment laws that are constantly evolving. And then on top of that, you have cannabis, which is legal in some states, federally it's illegal. Some states have different requirements. So in order to stay on top of things, HR is important in traditional cannabis, everyone in between. But in order to make sure that everything that these business owners have poured their blood, sweat, and tears into and continues to grow, yes, HR is going to take a little bit of a different approach. One other aspect I see a lot of times in the cannabis realm is that operators are hiring family members, cousins, girlfriends, and they just put them in charge of HR, and they tell them, hey, go to Google and whatever you find is what we're going to do. And that will not fly. And as soon as that gets flagged and something goes wrong, everything, again, that they've poured their blood, sweat, and tears into is going to get wiped out by one lawsuit.
Yeah, that's no good. Always, and so Brian, what about from the insurance side?
Yeah, I think what Emily's saying is right. I mean, there's a lot of the one thing that we've noticed in the last 8 years of being in the cannabis industry, and it's very unique to insurance, is the cannabis operators that we talk to, and even from a new venture, even all the way up to a larger MSO, they love cannabis. They love the industry. They love being part of this industry. And the one thing that we see is they check the box with insurance, and we have the conversations about the HR handbooks, about your protocols, and making sure that you have the right risk management and understanding that. And that's the hardest part sometimes, to have someone understand is that what if, and understanding by not checking the right boxes, it really does cause issues down the road. And the one thing with compliance is, like Emily's saying, we see that, oh, my wife does it or my husband handles it, and it's checking those boxes, and not understanding that, oh, when you plan to scale and grow and you want to rent another building, your insurance is a hurdle to get into that building. Understanding you have the correct coverages to do that. And then from a professional liability standpoint, understanding when you start hiring friends and relatives and cousins and next door neighbors, and there's a lot of things there, and you need to do it the right way, and having the compliance and having the right SOP for hiring, for performance plans, for your employees is very important. And people overlook that, and we talk to people every day, and they don't have that, and that's the scary part. They're investing a lot of money into these businesses, and when it comes to the backbone of really where they need to get started from, like we said earlier, it's just checking the box. And because we have an insurance policy, but we haven't really looked at what we're getting coverage for.
Yeah, and it's going to touch on the, the HR handbook and the SOPs, and they are very important to have, but in actuality, being compliant in practice is much different than just having it on paper. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to doing a site inspection and there's been, let's just say there's like metric tags just laying on the ground next to the plant rather than, being actually attached to the plant and other simple violations. And they're like, oh, and then before I could do that, they're very confident. They, oh yeah, we have this SOP, we have our handbook, and everyone's really trained. But then you go into the actual field, the field or the operation, and it seems like no, everyone's just kind of doing what they want. So, in your guys' experience, what has been that kind of disconnect from relying on the paper and the actual practice of it, and what do you think kind of creates a disconnect?
I'll jump in just because it's something we see. It's not going to happen to me. I mean, we see that all the time. It's not going to happen. My next door neighbor's not going to sue me. My friend, my cousin's not going to steal from me, and they're going to do the right thing. And I think that's a lot of that perception is it's just not going to happen to me, and it is. And statistically we're seeing it. Everyone across the board is seeing these issues. And it's a little bit of naiveness to not really understanding what the business and all the different perils that are out there coming after them.
Yeah. And Emily, do you see kind of how businesses can implement the handbook rather than just rely on the paper?
Yeah, I would say that truly compliance and training, it really will only work if it's built into the job and built into what you do every single day as opposed to a one-time event. So handbooks, SOPs, it's great if you have them sign off on it when they're hired, but consistent training, onboarding training, and following exactly what your handbook and your SOPs are saying is what's going to make the biggest world of difference. If you're not doing training with clear expectations and you're not doing ongoing refreshers as regulations change or as new laws or policies come out, then it's no good. And just because your handbook says something and it's signed, okay, so what if you don't actually do updated trainings or non-harassment trainings, or you don't do these when they're supposed to be done and you don't have a system that tracks the dates that they're supposed to be done by? It's great if you have a little bit of, handbook or SOPs in the beginning, but if you're not consistently keeping up with that and weaving that training into your everyday job, then it really is no good. To your point, it's no good.
Yeah, and accountability. There's someone there needs to hold everyone accountable for everything. And that's going back to your previous point about hiring friends and family. That can be, that sometimes that is kind of an issue because they're afraid to hold their family members accountable where, you have to. It's your business. So Hiko, as an operator, and a lawyer, what's kind of the disconnect that you see between reliance on paper and practicality?
Yeah, I mean, I'll emphasize Emily's point in that, I always make the analogy when you look at elite teams, right? And you look at the ratio of practice and training to actual performance in games, it's huge, right? And then you get to cannabis and people, you know, I think when people get into the industry, they think that it really is just about growing the plant and making the products and selling it, which is, obviously a big piece of it. But where you see businesses fail more often than not are around these foot fouls and these trials that you have with respect to the full implementation and the compliance. Again, compliance, and let's say related to that is the tracking of the inventory, right? All of the seed to sale, but not just the seed to sale, but really knowing what's going on, having real business intelligence, and being able to report to all the stakeholders. And it really people just completely overlook the cost of not doing it, right? It's this sort of we need to hurry up, get it to market, and we'll deal with it later. So we have a handbook. It's sitting in the corner. It's collecting dust, but that's good enough. But the amount of litigation when you're starting a company, you're not going to hire all the right people on day one. It's just not going to happen. So there's going to be churn in the early, especially in the early stages. So you have to make sure that all of the HR is really buttoned up. And then in contract, right? We mentioned the litigation that we're seeing, And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen over and over again is, especially again, when you're starting a company and you're starting a contract, you have phases and ramp ups and conditions precedent and all kinds of notice requirements written in the contract. But people say, well, we don't need it. We have the contract, we're operating. And so things happen, things go south, and then you find out that in fact there was never proper notice. And so then it becomes a question of, if it gets to arbitration or litigation, then it becomes just really, a question of whose facts are better, and talk about the cost of litigating that, relative to just making sure that, if there's a notice requirement, that you give proper notice, et cetera. So it really, you cannot emphasize this point enough, right? You go into this very, very enthusiastic and optimistic and starry-eyed, and this feeling of complete, utter urgency at all times. But fast is definitely not less expensive, and I can say that from quite a bit of experience.
Yeah, yeah. And we're talking about training and everything, and I think that is one priority, you're when not only just when building or starting a business, but that because by emphasizing on training and compliance, it helps you scale. I feel like that is one very important, crucial priority that needs to be taken into consideration is if you're looking, if you're when you're starting and if you're looking to scale at some point or just grow at any sort of level, there needs to be systems involved in the training to ensure because you can't, if you have multiple locations, you can't have you can't be there on location every place. So you have to rely on your training, on your employees, on your SOP. You have to be able to trust that your employees are following those SOPs. And so that's one thing that I think that if you're looking for growth, that is definitely a priority that needs to be taken into consideration. Is there any other priorities that you guys would recommend that startups focus on if they're looking to expand in the future?
Well, I would say, I mean, I think, Jared, I think you nailed it, right? And this is sort of what we've been talking about. But again, if you're not training, right? If everything is a complete top down hierarchy, and you're the type of founder who just does everything, then you simply cannot scale. It's just not possible, right? You have to be able to trust your team, and the only way you can trust your team is if you have the training, the communication, the expectations, the accountability. You cannot, you can't overstate that. So. Again, I think that's a really important point to emphasize in this.
Yeah.
Um,
Piggybacking off on
yeah.
sorry, Jared. But yes, exactly what they just said. Like, if you do not have that foundation and infrastructure in place, it doesn't matter if you have one employee, five employees, and you're growing to 500 employees. If it breaks down around the five employees where, you're that, like, for instance, we do payroll. There are payroll partners out there that are cannabis compliant that are perfect for the around five employee range. But as soon as you get more than five employees, they can't handle keeping track of training, making sure that all of their onboarding paperwork is in the right place. There's just little things that are not fun or sexy to even think about. But then when you have more employees and your workload gets bigger and your plate is fuller, you can't not think about all of these things as you could when you maybe had five employees. So you have to have the right partners in place. You have to have the right foundation structure, because as soon as something goes wrong, you have to be able to say, oh, I know exactly how to fix that, or we have everything in place so that it's not an issue. But if you don't and you're scaling, then it is going to be a huge nightmare in terms of fines, liability, lawsuits, and then at that point, you're reactive instead of being proactive.
Yeah, completely agree. Brian, do you want to touch on that or do
Yeah,
you?
I think the biggest thing for just understanding and setting the expectation of just, painting the picture, and you hate to say like worst case scenario, but having that realistic and those hard conversations with an insured or with someone that's a new venture that's starting, and they always seem to downplay, well, I just work out of my garage or I work out of a small a small space. It's no big deal. I don't need to worry about that equipment right now or that. So having them understand the business interruption part of that and really how and the realistic timelines. These aren't pizza shops. They aren't dry cleaners. So if you were to if your business were to if your building were to catch on fire, if you would have a hurricane that knocks out your distribution network, um, having them understand that you just can't pull up stakes and go across the street. There's a complexity for compliance, for licensing, and there's a long tail to that. It just doesn't you can't just start over next week. And having them understand how the insurance works in that and the mechanisms in the policy that help with that business interruption coverage.
Yeah, and kind of get to your that we're talking about training as being a priority from the beginning, from the jump. And I want to kind of talk about the cannabis industry has changed a lot since the beginning of legalization. And one thing that I would recommend today, if there was, that would be different than I was recommending early on before regulation, was that, as Brian, you're mentioning, the timeline to get those licenses is, I think people underestimate how long it actually takes to acquire license with local and state approval. So one thing I would recommend is if someone's starting is look for existing licenses. They are being sold for pennies on the dollar these days. I know back in 2019 you could just in California you could get a license and you can sell it for multiple millions of dollars just for the license. And so that's one thing I would recommend, and that one thing I would do recommend differently now than before, because now before and early on you would need a lot of cash. Now you can get pre-built buildings for pennies on the dollar. Is there anything else that you guys are seeing that would change that has changed in your recommendations for startups compared to the early days to now?
Hmm. I guess I could jump in there. And kind of related to what you're saying, Jared, I think, there was always a very, very strong sense of urgency and the benefit of first mover advantage and early to market. But one of the things that we saw in many states, New York, again, being a prime example, a lot of the operators who were first to market actually saw a number of months where there was litigation that was holding up opening up new retail establishments. There were all kinds of issues related and similar, where you had an enormous amount of carrying cost and without a market to sell to. And then, of course, while learning these systems. So you had, at first in New York, everyone was getting ramped up and ready and signing contracts for service providers for BioTrack. And then on the 11th and a half hour, the OCM changed and said, oh, changed our mind. We're going to metric. And so they really, the advantage of early mover advantage and moving quickly. And like we said, this tendency to really want to move and get going and not put the things in place that you need to and not look at it carefully, not analyze it, right? There's still an enormous, in fact, I often argue there's more of an opportunity now in cannabis than ever before, because of the fact that, a lot of the people who got in with the wrong ideas have kind of made all of the mistakes for us, and, have given us the opportunity to learn. But to, take it slow, right? Really, really make sure that every step is buttoned up.
Going off of that, I would say that I'm seeing that there's almost a perception that as the industry as a whole becomes more mainstream or socially acceptable, that things will possibly get easier. And, when companies start first built operations, it may have been more informal because there wasn't a lot of legislation in place. But I would argue that the more that the industry grows, the higher our standards are truly going to become. So we have to get rid of that perception that, oh, this is becoming, we're going to declassify it and it's going to become legal in all 50 states, that maybe our high standards or what we're held accountable for is going to decrease. But it truly is just the standard is going to become higher. And my goal is I want to make sure that our industry gets professionalized. And that starts with, again, the foundation. And operators that maybe started 5 years ago are having to go back and fix things, which they're seeing is, shoot, it's more expensive. And to Bryan's point, disruptive. Then, okay, now it's more professionalized. Well, we want to help you professionalize your business. And that, again, starts with everything that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and to kind of go off on that, thinking about future proofing and thinking about what's even going to happen in the future, do you guys have any predictions or what do you guys think is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years when it comes to cannabis regulations? Do you think that the federal government's finally going to deschedule or legalize or kind of? I'll pass it to you, Suehiko, to go first on that.
Sure. Um, it's very, very difficult to predict what's going to happen at the national level these days. To state that lightly. It looked like at the beginning of this year, it was a near certainty that rescheduling was going to happen. And I think, it's still more likely than not. However, I think it's also very important to really understand what that means. So for a recreational operator, for example, I think it doesn't change really functionally what's happening for that cohort, right? Because if it is rescheduled, it's going to then change within the framework of FDA, DEA, and so it's going to change quite a bit. But one of the things you can kind of start to do is again professionalize, right? Bring your facilities, especially if you're a manufacturer or processor, bring it to GMP standard, right? And getting the systems in place, the track and trace, the traceability, right? These are the things that are really going to set the stage for this transition. Should you decide to go into that framework of scheduled, the controlled substance, and so I think it's still very hard to predict, and that's one of the things you want to figure out. How can you professionalize this? How can you get the systems in place, scale it, build in efficiencies, not just in the actual operations, but in all the things that we've been talking about, so that you're prepared, but also have optionality. Again, I think if you stay in the recreational side, then you're still going to be in this gray area of federal illegality. And so there's still a lot of questions of what that means. But the more you can set this up with the systems, with the ability to scale and with the ability to pivot, then the better you're going to be.
Bryan, how do you, if there is rescheduling, what would be the impact on the insurance
Well,
business?
yeah, I mean, there's still going to be the primary perils that we all see. I mean, the product liability. There's still going to be all the things that we talk about. I think what'll happen with rescheduling is we're going to see more carriers come in and get involved. Some of the more national carriers be, start to poke around and look at ways to get into the cannabis industry, whether it's indirectly, whether it could be the construction side of it, the build outs, the shopping centers that they're in, more commercial property than the specific cannabis coverages. And I think the carriers that are in the market now do a great job. They've been in it. They've been in it now since 2013, 14. So they have enough historical data really to offer the cannabis operators. Where we'll see capacity come from is going to be more on the property side, on the professional side, which will be great for the industry as a whole as it begins to become more Main Street. I also think we'll start to see fewer exclusions in the policy, and because the policy language will start to tighten up as it becomes more Main Street, in product liability. So that's one of the some of the coverage gaps now, where I think once we start bringing in more carriers, more data to support it, the policy language exclusions will get better for the insureds.
Thank you. And Emily, I know because for HR, there are, businesses already have to comply with all the HR regulations or people regulations. So would anything really change with descheduling or legalization on the federal level?
Honestly, again, kind of like what both Bryan and Suehiko already said, it's very hard to predict, but at Greenleaf, we are very intentional about making sure that obviously everybody is compliant state specifically. So it's not really going to change what we do day to day, but that's not to say that federal or state laws aren't going to change, which then obviously we will pivot and adapt as need be.
And we have, we're going to jump to Q&A because there's one that is kind of pertinent. It's, could you give, uh, yeah, it says, could you give an update on acceptance of cannabis entities by banks? I, for the most part, I believe there's for at least on the California side, there are a lot of credit unions are accepting cannabis businesses. There's a lot. You're not going to get the mainstay B of A, Wells Fargo that are going to be accept cannabis businesses. But I've also seen there's also been larger entities be able to find credit facilities at reasonable rates. At this point, I've seen 6-7%, which is standard for
Mhm.
businesses these days. Before they'd be getting 20-15%. And so I think the banking options has significantly opened from the beginning, but it's not like your traditional businesses. But that will change with federal regulation, descheduling. I believe more banks will be open up to that because they won't have to follow the stringent regulatory rules in accepting cannabis money. I don't know if you guys want to touch on that question as well.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
oh,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, well, no, Jared, I was just gonna, echo what you said. We're seeing the same thing in New York on the East Coast, New Jersey, Massachusetts. There are, there's in particular, right? There's not going to be the larger national banks, not yet. I haven't seen that, and in fact, I'd be very careful about opening accounts and transferring money from cannabis related businesses. But at the in credit unions, there are quite a bit more banks, and to Jared's point, a very important piece of this is that we are seeing more credit loans at reasonable business rates. So it's definitely there's reason to be very optimistic about banking and credit.
Mhm. We're seeing the same thing. So local banks, community banks, the credit unions we're seeing, and how that's working with us is a lot of those institutions do have an insurance arm. So we're working with them to help them understand the complexities of insurance when they're doing their loans and their build outs, their property purchases. So it's all coordinated. But we are seeing it. It has picked up. I would say over the last probably 12 to 18 months, we've seen where they're aggressively, seems like the banking is starting to go after the cannabis businesses more.
Hope that answered your question. And then another question, Brian, this one's kind of related to you or focused on your business. From a risk management standpoint, how challenging is it for cannabis business owners to secure personal and business related protection, such as life insurance, disability coverage, or key person and buy sell funding? And where do you typically see gaps or misconceptions in that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't do anything with any of the life insurance stuff. I work with a couple brokers that are doing life insurance. So specifically, I don't work in that world. I can certainly pass your information along if you'd like for life insurance. Key employee, we can do that as well. And that's a great question, and that's a great point because um, the one thing as we're talking about building up new ventures and you're building out your team is if you lose that key employee, what does that do to your business? Or if your key employee goes to a competitor, what does that do to your business? So there's complexity around that. Or if they get hit by a bus, and now you built your business on that one person. So that is something we can help with and we can talk through, and that's all part of as we're building out, what is your plan? What are you doing long term? Having those correct coverages in place are important, so we can help with that. What was the other part of the question?
Are there, and where do you typically see gaps or misconceptions in that process?
Yeah, the gap is back to what we were talking about earlier, just the assumption that they think they have those coverages, they think that their current policy or life insurance policy is there and they will have no issue getting it. So back to what Emily's doing with hiring from an employee standpoint for compliance, having that built out for employee benefits and having them understand that the cannabis is different. It is becoming more mainstream. There are more carriers getting involved in cannabis from a professional standpoint, GL from property, and which is a great thing for our industry. So there's more opportunities. 5 or 6 years ago, you couldn't get life insurance for a key employee. So it is evolving, and now that we have more data to support it, you're able to get those coverages. It's still not the easiest thing to get, but with the correct compliance with your SOPs and having all that, the underwriters understand your business, that obviously helps fill in those gaps.
Yeah, and to touch on the life insurance part of it, I do know that individuals can get life insurance because, especially especially it's a cash business, and we
Mhm.
just talked about difficulty not having if there's not availability of national banks. So if you do have cash, life insurance policy is sometimes a good spot to store cash, and if that is your liking and have that ability. Uh, all right, hope that answers your question. All right, Raymond, we'll move to your question. Are there unique things to include in an employee handbook for a cannabis company? Emily?
I mean, yes, of course. I would say that a cannabis employee handbook obviously still needs all of the standard policies that traditional handbooks would have, things like harassment, wage and hour attendance, but there are definitely unique things that need to be tailored to the industry and then to a business as a whole. Every single business is completely different. You're going to have different standards and ideas of what you want your business to emphasize. And so every single handbook is going to be completely different. But in cannabis, one thing that I actually just saw I think 2 weeks ago, is that something that we probably don't really think about in the industry, but a drug and alcohol policy. It sounds pretty straightforward, but in cannabis, it's clearly not because a lot of states, employees are protected for off duty cannabis use. So traditional tolerance policy can really actually create legal risk if it's not written correctly. That's just one example. I'm sure that you guys could come up with a lot of different examples, but that is something that I have recently been seeing a lot that cannabis operators aren't thinking about, but it is crucially important. So, yes, there are definitely unique things to include in employee handbooks for cannabis companies as a whole, but then for specific companies for themselves.
And that's a
And I,
good point. Yeah, that's a great point because from an insurance perspective, as we do commercial auto and trucking and transit, some of the delivery services that are starting to pop up, when there's an accident, the first thing that typically happens is a drug test. When there's an accident on with a company vehicle, so those are some of the hurdles that we're all trying to navigate through. Is obviously if there's 9 times out of 10, if there's a drug test, they're gonna there's going to be THC there. So those are the things that we're working with our carriers to talk through to make sure that they have the right coverage in place for because cannabis is so unique. These little things do pop up, and you don't think about it until it happens, and then you kind of, like Emily's saying, you kind of shake your head like, yeah, we can't have that, we can't have this because they're in the cannabis industry. So there's certain things we're navigating as things are coming up.
yeah, I would add too, make sure you look the specific state regulations because they will have. I don't know of any state that doesn't actually have specific requirements for the handbook, just directly stated in the regs for each state, and in particular things that have to do with training, on-site consumption, sampling, stuff like that. Specific to cannabis handbooks, employee handbooks.
Yeah, so there's plenty of specific cannabis specific items that need to go in there, and also, cross-reference your SOPs as well. And so I hope, Raymond, I hope that answers your question. We'll move on to the next. Princess. Jared, I mentioned that there being cannabis businesses available for pennies on the dollar. Can you link to some resources? Reach out to me directly. I can send you some. They do pop up on the same some of them do pop up on the same postings and that traditional businesses are for sale on. There's also I would check receiverships. If that there a lot of companies are going through receivership right now, and those are being sold at a diminished value. So yeah, Princess, if you want to reach out to me directly, I can provide you with some of those resources. Um, and then Casey, what do you think is the biggest hurdle for most new cannabis companies entering the space? Anyone want to jump on that?
Well, the single biggest, I mean, aside from let's say capital raise, right? That's definitely a challenge. But in a lot of states, especially in the Northeast, what I'm seeing, whether you're talking about Mass, New Jersey, New York, it's actually locating the suitable real estate for the operation, right? So, aside from obviously capital raise and structuring things that we've talked about, and of course, getting through the application process, but but real estate is getting more suitable real estate where the local municipality and the zoning allows for the activity is becoming more and more difficult.
And then one thing for brand new cannabis companies, especially in California, it's a more mature market, is you're breaking into the market. You can't, just because you have a license, have an operation, doesn't mean consumers are going to be looking for your products. So I would definitely, before jumping into a new venture, build up that brand, build up brand notoriety because you're gonna need it to get shelving space unless you're a retailer. But to get shelving space, you're gonna have to need to have consumers demand your product. So you need to kind of build in that demand. And so I think that is if you're not, at least if you're not a retail, that would be one of my biggest hurdles I've seen. Um,
Yeah, and to that point too, Jared, I'd say model it, right? Make sure there is a market for your product, and then make sure that you have a workable financial model that is reasonable and very importantly takes into account the considerations of everything we've talked about, right? The compliance overhead, the HR overhead, 280E, all of these things are very important, and I see them almost universally overlooked when people are starting new businesses. So that's an important piece.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Casey. That and before that, I want to thank everyone. But before we kind of get going, I want to have everyone have a chance to give one last piece of advice that you'd give to founders starting today. What would that be? And we'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is from a risk management standpoint is talk with your broker and really it's that they're there to help you. They're there to protect your risk and they're there to help you scale. And really having those conversations with where the future is going to take you will only help you build out. And a lot of times a new venture one they're not sure, but they don't want to ask stupid questions. They don't want to say something that possibly is going to offend the broker. So the biggest thing is just transparency and having the best communication with them will only help you in the long run.
Emily?
I would say that truly treating your people infrastructure the same way that you treat your license. And I think that everybody would agree that you wouldn't open a cannabis business without making sure that your license is in place, obviously. And I think that a lot of companies will hire employees without having that compliant HR, payroll systems in place. And you just need a strong HR infrastructure to insulate risk and to set your business up for scalability and growth.
Suehiko?
Yeah, I think, right now the opportunity really is for operators who do these things correctly. There is an enormous opportunity. The market continues to grow across the United States, Northeast in particular. There's more states opening up. Delaware is opening, and various others. And I think to the extent that an operator can do this very carefully and very intentionally, planning these things out, modeling it correctly, and being very, very careful about it, and be very careful about, let's say, overly optimistic modeling, right? You have to be prepared to be in it for the long haul and take your bumps and bruises. But stay the course and do it right. Steer it correctly. And there's an enormous amount of opportunity.
Yeah, and to take advantage of that opportunity, I know it's exciting to enter into partnerships, get funding, and take before you sign anything, have a legal review. Don't trust on I know it's coming from a biased standpoint, but trust me, I've seen all the horrible issues of people not having not having the operating agreement viewed, or not having the partnership agreement, not having the loan document reviewed, and they're agreeing to terrible terms that can really ruin a business before it even starts. And so I can't, stress that enough. Just have an attorney put some eyes on it, give you advice on the risks, so you're fully well aware of the risks and whether you sign it or not. That's kind of one piece of advice I'd give a startup is don't sign anything without having a proper review on it, and so you know what you're getting into. Well, again, thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope you would have a great rest of the day. I hope we provided great value for you during your lunch or your morning, depending on where you are. And yeah, thank you so much. See you again.